Time for Andrew Bone, our recruiting analyst, senior recruiting analyst for BamaInsider.com, part of the Rivals.com network. Joins us every Wednesday for the latest on the Crimson Tide recruiting efforts with our Bama Football Recruiting Report. And Bone, it was a big weekend for Alabama football in a lot of ways. The game, the hype, the build-up, all the folks that were in town, the President of the United States, the football game. But it was also huge for recruiting. Big weekend of both official and unofficial visitors. Before we get into specifics, talking with guys, getting your intel together, how do you think it went for Alabama over the weekend?
I thought it was good. No commitments, which we weren't really expecting any commitments. I mentioned last week that, if anybody were to commit, it would probably be an underclassman because most of these 2020 guys that, they come in, they see a good game. They may have been on an official visit. Some were on unofficial visits. And most of these guys, they've waited this long to commit. They may as well just wait until December in that early signing period to commit. So most of these guys, we knew going in that they weren't going to make a decision, but it thought maybe a 2021 kid or two may commit, but no commitments yet. But overall, talking to dozens and dozens of recruits after the weekend, even though Alabama lost, it was still an unbelievable atmosphere, an unbelievable game. So they were most everybody that I talked to said they were happy that they made the trip because it was well worth it.
Yeah, no doubt about that. All right, let's get into some specifics. And before we're done with this interview, I'm going to ask you about recruiting etiquette in terms of the visiting team. But let's start with a no-show. Not a surprise. This guy has been like this. Zack Evans, the running back from Houston, did not make it in. I'm going to ask you this question, Bone, because I don't know. But I'm just kind of getting the impression, being here in town, being around the program, I don't think Alabama's counting on this guy much. That's just my take.
I don't think so. Zack Evans, number one running back in the country out of Houston, has visited Alabama several times throughout his high school career, and we talked about him during the summer when he visited in June, and there was a lot of buzz about his visit and that he was maybe close to making a decision, but it seems like he's been close to making a decision for every team that he has visited, whether that's Georgia, Texas A&M, LSU. It seems like every time he goes on a visit, when he does make it, he comes off that visit extremely high on that program, and he's only days away from making a commitment to that school. So, we did expect him to make the trip to Tuscaloosa this past weekend. Two of his top teams, Alabama and LSU, definitely two of his top four teams, and has already visited both programs this season. So, we knew that he had made some, he had canceled some trips to a few programs this fall. It hadn't shown up. There were some camps during the summer that he didn't show up to, like the 5-Star Challenge for Rivals and the opening. Just kind of a weird situation where he just doesn't show up at some places. But definitely expected him in this past weekend and didn't show up. But as of right now, I'd be surprised if he ended up in Alabama's class. You look at Alabama's, outstanding running back class that they have right now with Roydell Williams and Kyle Edwards, two, really good, underrated running backs, in my opinion. And, I think with Alabama, likely to have Brian Robinson back next season, I'd be surprised if Brian Robinson ended up leaving. I'm not saying that Alabama is not trying to get Zack Evans on board, but it makes things a lot easier when you do have two running backs committed. And you don't necessarily have to go after and have to make sure you add a third running back in this class. So I think regardless, Alabama's going to be fine at the running back position, at least in the 2020 class. And, we'll see what happens. I mean, there's some other running backs that are out there that they still have their eye on. But as of right now, I wouldn't be surprised if Alabama might be done at the running back position. I
wouldn't be either, but Jace McClellan was in for an official this past weekend. Of course, he's committed to Oklahoma, but how did his visit go?
Well, I heard, through the grapevine that things went pretty well. His mom was in town with him, and they had a really good visit. But at the same time, I think something had to have happened, whereas, he had to flip from Oklahoma to Alabama or Oklahoma to somewhere else. Whereas whether that was a coaching change, a visit that, he comes to Tuscaloosa and it's just like, I cannot go anywhere else. And I just don't see that as the case. I think he's pretty content on his commitment to Oklahoma. He hasn't said a whole lot since his visit to Tuscaloosa this past weekend. And I just, you never know what may happen. I know Nick Saban will probably still do an in-home visit with him, but as of right now, can't really see him flipping away from his commitment to Oklahoma. I think he's pretty happy with where things are. Now we've seen crazier things in recruiting. In Alabama, I definitely think they're in the race, but if I were to make a prediction right now, I think he would stick with Oklahoma.
I'm with you there. All right, I think you could watch the game on Saturday, and even though Four-Star was out, it's obvious Alabama needs a tight end. They got one committed, but they need another one, and the hope was that it would be Eric Gilbert. He committed to LSU. Darnell Washington is a guy that's extremely talented. It looked as though maybe Alabama was done with him, but he took an official this weekend. And from what I understand, reading your story, he brought his girlfriend in, he brought his baby. Where's that stand?
Well, I think Alabama's in it. Prior to the visit, I would say they were not in it. I think he had an unbelievable trip to Tuscaloosa, based on the interview that we have posted with him on BamaInsider. I mean, he talked very highly about the trip, knows that Alabama's going to get the ball to its playmakers, and, has a really good relationship with the coaching staff there. And I think Alabama just has to continue to chip away there. They'll do an in-home visit with him in December and just kind of see where things go. Like I said, I think Alabama was on the outside with him heading into the weekend, but I think they've put themselves at least in the race. Not ready to predict him to Alabama just yet, but I do think Alabama's in the race. I'd probably still give the edge to Georgia, but the in-home visits are going to be big. When Nick Saban goes into your home and sits down with you and lays out the plan. A lot of people think recruiting's over, or things are over once the kid takes his official visit. Well, that's just not true. Things are over when Nick Saban leaves your home and you decide that, all right, I'm going to go somewhere else. So, and Nick Saban's always been known as the ultimate closer, and definitely a guy that can go into a home and sell you on the Alabama program. So that's something that we'll be watching pretty closely down the road. But I do think Alabama has definitely done a good job recruiting him over the last few weeks, ever since Eric Gilbert did commit to LSU, because I don't think they were really pushing hard for Darnell Washington, and I think that has really changed with Gilbert's decision. Now, there's all these rumors and speculation out there that, all right, so if Alabama doesn't get Darnell Washington, they're going to go after another tight end. They're going to potentially go after J.J. Pigas from Oxford, Mississippi, who was in Tuscaloosa this past weekend. Mm-hmm. And there's some other guys out there that they're kind of keeping their eye on. But from what I understand, it's probably going to be Darnell Washington or bust. If they don't get Darnell Washington on board, I think they're going to kind of focus in on potentially some graduate transfer tight ends and see who's out there. And the 2021 class will obviously be very important at the tight end position. But from what I've been told, they're going after Darnell Washington, and if they don't get him, they may not get it. They may not take anybody else at the tight end position.
All right, you put out an interesting tidbit on Arian Smith, the wide receiver out of Florida, who I've been told here that really, really loves Alabama. Might have committed to Alabama had they made a stronger attempt at recruiting him. Now, this is me talking. You may want to correct me on this. That's what I've heard. But he was in over the weekend and seems to have renewed enthusiasm in regards to the Crimson Tide. Outstanding athletic wide receiver. What are you hearing on him?
Just continuing to chip away there. I talked to Arian Smith after his visit to Alabama, and he had a great time. I mean, definitely said that he loves the offense. Feels like he's a perfect fit on the Tide's team. And I think with him, Alabama was on the outside for him Of course, we keep saying that with a lot of these guys, but that they were. Arian Smith didn't have Alabama in his top 5, 3 months ago. All of a sudden, put him in his top 5 prior to the visit. Now they're in his top 3. So has Alabama, Clemson, and Georgia as his top 3 schools. Still has official visits to take. Says that he wants to wait until maybe even February to make a decision. So we'll just have to wait and see what happens. Alabama likes him a lot. Alabama has a great wide receiver class with 3 wide receiver commitments. They're still looking to add one more to that group. Arian Smith is certainly a kid that they really like. They like Raheem Jarrett, Kashawn Booty, Xavier Henderson, Brian Robinson. There's about 5 wide receivers throughout the country that they really like a lot. They really want to get one more on board. Arian Smith is certainly one of those guys that they have very high interest in. They would be happy to take a commitment from. One of the fastest players in the country, actually recruited by most schools to also be a part of their track program. Spent some time with Alabama track coach Dan Waters on Saturday. Really liked what he had to hear from him. So that's something that we'll be watching, pretty closely moving forward. But I think he had a great visit, and I think Alabama's in the race.
All right, one of the best players in the country was in as well, and that's Jordan Burch. Number 4 overall player in the Rivals 100. Outstanding defensive, chaos type of guy, can just create chaos, very athletic. Alabama's trying hard. This is a kid that doesn't say a lot. What were you able to piece together on him?
Still not much. He's definitely one of those kids that is going to keep things extremely quiet. I mean, just doesn't say anything to anybody. And anytime we try to gather information, whether it be a parent or a coach, it's just there's no luck there. So you try to pull some information out from different sources, and basically from what we heard, he had a really good conversation with Nick Saban. Really good to sit down with him. His mom sat down with Coach Saban as well. Had a ton of questions, got a ton of answers, and I think that I think Alabama's in it once again, but at the same time, it's hard to predict. A lot of people kind of assume that he's going to stay a little bit closer to home, that Clemson's probably in the driver's seat, or maybe he ends up at Georgia, which is only about, Athens is only about 2.5 hours away from Columbia, where he lives. I mean, a lot of people think, South Carolina's in it. I'd be surprised if he ended up at South Carolina, even though he lives in Columbia. I think Georgia, Clemson, possibly the top 2 for him, but it's hard to predict because it just doesn't say anything. You can't get any information out of him. If I were to predict right now, I don't think he ends up at Alabama. I think he'd stay a little bit closer to home. It was only his 3rd visit of the year to Alabama, but they're recruiting him. I mean, they're heavily pursuing him. They're going to do an in-home visit with him. But as of right now, would lean towards him going elsewhere.
All right, before we get to the break, I'm going to get Bone to hang around for a second segment. In the second segment, we will take your phone calls. If you want to ask Bone a question at 205-342-9904, that's the number on the Bud Light hotline. All right, I got to ask you about Philip Webb, who has been a long-time Alabama targeted linebacker. In fact, if you'd asked me back when the season started, I would have said, based on what I had read, that Philip Webb was going to be an Alabama commitment. LSU's not only a thorn in Alabama's side right now on the field, they've been a thorn in recruiting. We mentioned Gilbert, and you, along with other recruiting analysts, are pointing toward LSU as the eventual choice for Philip Webb, who was in on a visit over the weekend. What happened there? And I really thought this was a guy that was going to wind up in Alabama's class. What happened, Bone?
Well, I think LSU, as you mentioned, I think they've done a good job recruiting him. He visited Baton Rouge during the summer. He took an official visit there a few weeks ago, and I think they've I think they've overtaken everyone else. He took an unofficial visit to Alabama this past weekend, and it was his first visit of the year to Tuscaloosa. I just don't think Alabama's done enough to overtake LSU, and I don't know if that's necessarily a a huge loss. I think Alabama loves him. They certainly take him if he wanted to commit, but they're not looking for a replacement. And I always look at if they're looking for somebody to replace a key target, then it's a major loss. But they're not really looking for another player at that position. I mean, they're recruiting him, only him. If he ends up going somewhere else, then they're done at the position. So, I think Alabama's got some excellent pass rushers in this class. You got Quandarius Robinson, William Anderson, Chris Braswell. Those are all edge-type guys that are very similar to Philip Webb. Now, Philip Webb, obviously a special player, but so are these guys. I think Alabama's going to be, quite fine at one of these edge rusher, pass rusher type players in this class.
All right, it's 9:46 here on the Gary Harris Show. We're going to take a break. We'll be back with another segment with Andrew Bone.
Tide 100.9 and streaming on the Tide 100.9 app.
9:50. Welcome back in. A few more minutes with Andrew Bone here on the Gary Harris Show with the Bama Football Recruiting Report. All right, Bone, a couple more prospects I want to ask you about, and then we'll kind of let you wrap it, and then I want to ask you about recruiting etiquette in regards to the visiting team. Tim Smith, the big defensive lineman out of Florida, has been committed to Alabama for a while. Gators have really been pushing, but he was in this weekend, and you seem to feel like, based on what you wrote, that maybe Alabama shored things up with him a little bit?
Well, I think it helped. I think it helped getting him back on campus. I think that's been the biggest thing. Because he committed to Alabama, he hasn't been back in Tuscaloosa, and has been able to get over to Gainesville three or four times since his commitment to Alabama. And so they've certainly turned up the heat on him. But I think with him coming back up to Tuscaloosa, kind of feeling it back out and kind of having that same feeling when he first committed to Alabama, I think that certainly helped. And then he's going to come, and it was just an unofficial visit. So he's coming back for an official visit in December. I like where things stand with Alabama and him right now. I mean, I think at the end of the day, you still have to worry about Florida because they're still a little bit closer to home. They're still going to get an official visit from him, and they're still pressing extremely hard. But at the end of the day, I think Alabama's got a very good chance to hold on to him, and I think they will.
Good deal there. All right, I know there's some players I probably left out, so I'll just ask you in regards to wrapping up this official and unofficial big visit weekend for Alabama over the weekend. Anybody else that you want to mention that you think Alabama might be closing in on a commitment on, or just any other notes and tidbits that you want to pass along?
Well, there's an offensive lineman in the state of Alabama that I want to mention. Is Javion Cohen. He's a four-star lineman from Central High School in Phoenix City. Been committed to Auburn since I think he committed to Auburn in June. He was actually formerly committed to South Carolina, then flipped over to Auburn. Big kid that was in Tuscaloosa this past weekend for an unofficial visit. Alabama went and saw him a few weeks ago, and we know Alabama doesn't really have a lot of offensive linemen in this class, just two offensive line commitments right now. They're looking to add another one, and Javion Cohen was in Tuscaloosa. He's coming back for an official visit in December. Definitely somebody that Alabama has really turned the heat up on. They liked him a lot during the spring, but he was only about 270 pounds. They were kind of, he had been sick, so he was I think he had mono or something like that, and had lost a bunch of weight. So Alabama said, "Hey, we really need to get your weight up a little bit before we really press for you." Well, he showed up at Alabama on Saturday at 296 pounds, 6'5", 296 pounds. Alabama is extremely high on this kid, and I would really watch out for him over the course of the next month or so, because I think Alabama's got a good shot to flip him away from Auburn.
Yeah, good tidbit there. And I want to ask you about a 2021 prospect who I've watched play for the last couple of years, and that's Koolaid McKinstry out of Pinson Valley, who is just a phenomenal athlete. And I think a lot of people felt like, well, with Patrick Nix being his coach and Bo Nix, the quarterback at Auburn, having a close relationship with him, that Auburn might be the team to beat there. But you seem to feel like Alabama's in really good shape.
Yeah, we hadn't really written a lot about Koolaid this year just because, hadn't really heard about too many visits to Tuscaloosa. But what we've learned over the course of the last few days is a lot of the trips to Tuscaloosa have been pretty quiet. They just hadn't really announced them. It's just kind of gone down to Tuscaloosa and, wanted things to be pretty quiet about his trips down there. So he's actually made a lot more visits down to Alabama than what has been reported. And most of the time he goes down there, he spends, 2 or 3 days on campus. Got a great relationship with a ton of players on the team. Got a lot of friends down in Tuscaloosa and got a very good relationship with the coaching staff. So definitely a good, a good thing for Alabama to get him on campus as many times as they have, because he's the number one player in the state for 2021. And he's definitely got an opportunity to, be a 5-star recruit. A lot of people think that he could potentially play football and basketball in college. That's what he wants to. That's what he wants to do. He's got a lot of offers in basketball. Definitely a big name to watch in that 2021 class. He was one of several elite 2021 prospects in Tuscaloosa this past weekend. Several that were in state, several that were out of state, and I think this game probably mean more to a lot of underclassmen than maybe it did to some of these 2020 guys that are on campus.
All right, before we wrap it up, I want to ask you about recruiting etiquette. I've been going to games for a long time, and it always is kind of a weird dynamic when you've got the home school hosting recruits. Oftentimes the visiting school obviously has interest in some of the same recruits. Sometimes you may have the visiting school that might have a couple of their commitments visiting the home school. But it always seems to me that there's kind of been an unwritten rule that the visiting school doesn't actively, recruit the home school's recruits. Now, I know sometimes those recruits will go to the visiting locker room and wait for those guys to come out. I've seen that. But I thought what LSU's players did, of course, they were full of themselves a little bit. It was quite a celebration on the field and in the locker room. They hadn't beaten Alabama since 2011. But for their players to run over to the Alabama student recruiting section and, actually stand there on the field and say, hey, yeah, you need to come to LSU. I hadn't seen that before. Maybe it's happened and I just hadn't noticed it. I thought that was a little bit of a breach of etiquette. Where do you come down on that, Bone?
It probably didn't bother me, as much because, you never know how people are feeling in that situation. I mean, as you mentioned, LSU hadn't beaten Alabama since 2011, so they're celebrating. They're having a good time. They're probably still in a state of shock that they had just won at Alabama, so probably weren't sure how they were even acting. So, it didn't bother me that much. But yeah, we've seen some kids that I've tweeted back at them saying you should have heard what we were saying back to you in the stands.
Yeah.
I think that it's all in good fun. So I don't think it's going to really affect Alabama, or I don't think it's going to really affect any of those recruits who are up there.
Yeah, and I think sometimes, and we got about 30 seconds, if you've got a player that's being recruited that really is loyal or wants to go to a certain school and he sees that school lose on his visit, he says to himself, well, I could have made the difference. So sometimes it works out like that. But I did want to ask you about it because I've been asked about it a little bit. Hey, real quickly, give the folks the rundown on how they can get all the bad to the bone recruiting information.
Well, follow us at BamaInsider.com, part of the Rivals.com network. You can sign up for a 30-day free trial right now. Get all the information. You can follow me on my Twitter handle at Andrew J. Bone, and follow us on our YouTube channel at Bama Insider.
Thanks a lot, Bone.
Thanks, Gary.